For 40 years, there was a secret army hidden underneath Western Europe. Not a figure of speech, a real one. Hidden caches of weapons and explosives buried in forests and cemeteries and mountainsides. Lists of trusted men, quietly recruited and secretly trained in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Radios, gold, and escape plans, all waiting in the dark for a signal that, thankfully, never came. It stretched across country after country, and almost no ordinary citizen, no ordinary member of parliament had the faintest idea it existed. And then, in the autumn of 1990, the Prime Minister of Italy stood up in front of his own parliament and admitted the whole thing was real. Its Italian code name was Gladio, the Latin word for a short sword. And in the years since that confession, it has become one of the most misunderstood stories of the entire Cold War, pulled violently in two directions. On one side are people who wave it away as paranoid fantasy, the kind of thing conspiracy theorists invent. On the other are people who have turned it into a monster that explains everything, a vast NATO terror machine that secretly slaughtered its own citizens across Europe for decades. Here's the uncomfortable thing. Both of those camps are wrong, and the truth sits in the difficult ground between them. Gladio is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented, official, confirmed history. Prime ministers admitted it. The European Parliament formally condemned it. Investigating judges pulled the files out of Secret Service archives. Anyone who tells you it never existed is simply wrong. This is not a case where a lone researcher claims to have uncovered a hidden plot that the authorities deny. Here, the authorities themselves confirmed that a sitting head of government stood up and admitted on the record that the secret army was real. That almost never happens, and it is why Gladio occupies such a strange place in Cold War history. An official secret that the officials were finally forced to own. But the maximal version, the one that says this secret army was, from the start, a coordinated program to murder European civilians and blame it on the left, runs far past what the evidence actually supports. Parts of that dark story are genuinely documented, especially in Italy. Other parts are allegation, inference, and the work of authors whose sweeping claims professional historians treat with real caution. The honest account has to hold both of those truths at once. A real secret army, born of a real fear that in at least one country blurred into something genuinely sinister, and a wall of speculation built on top of it that goes well beyond what anyone has proven. So this is the story of what Gladio actually was. Where it truly came from, which is stranger and more logical than the myth suggests. What it was designed to do, and where, exactly, the solid ground of evidence ends and the shadow of speculation begins, because knowing the difference is the whole point. It starts not with a plot to attack Europe, but with a very real terror that Europe was about to be swallowed whole. To understand Gladio, you have to feel the fear that created it, and it was not an imaginary one. In the years right after the Second World War, Western Europe lay exhausted and broken, and just to the east stood the Red Army, enormous, battle-hardened, and sitting on the far side of a line that split the continent in two. Western military planners looked at that force and reached a chilling conclusion. If the Soviets ever decided to attack, there was a real chance they could sweep across Western Europe in a matter of weeks, maybe less. The armies of the West, in those early years, might not be able to stop them. So the planners asked a grim question. If the Soviets do overrun us, if Paris and Rome and Brussels fall under communist occupation, what then? And they found their answer in the recent past. During the war against Hitler, resistance movements had harassed the occupiers from within, blowing up rail lines, gathering intelligence, hiding downed pilots, keeping hope alive behind enemy lines. What if, this time, you didn't wait for occupation to build a resistance? What if you built it in advance? That was the idea behind the stay-behind networks. The plan was to recruit and train secret cells of civilians ahead of time, and to hide caches of weapons, explosives, and radios all across the country. If the Soviets invaded and the government fled into exile, these people would not run. They would stay behind. That was the whole point, melting into the occupied population and then rising up as a ready-made resistance, sabotaging the occupiers and linking back to the exiled government and its allies. It was, on its own terms, a rational contingency for a catastrophe everyone genuinely feared. And it was organized at the highest levels. The networks were sponsored and funded above all by the American CIA and the British Intelligence Service, and coordinated through the new NATO alliance, working hand in hand with the secret services of each individual country. The blueprint came straight out of the war that had just ended. During the fight against Hitler, Allied services like Britain's Special Operations Executive and America's OSS had specialized in exactly this kind of work, parachuting agents behind enemy lines, arming partisans, running clandestine cells. When the Cold War froze into place, many of the same men and the same techniques were simply turned toward a new occupier who might come from the east. And to keep the national networks pulling in the same direction, coordination ran through secret committees tied to NATO, quietly linking the stay-behind services of the member states to one another and to their American and British sponsors. The secrecy was total by design. This was an apparatus meant to survive even the collapse of the governments above it. This was not just an Italian project, it was continental. Stay-behind networks were set up across Western Europe, each with its own national codename. In Italy, it was Gladio. In Belgium, SDRA-8. In the Netherlands, I&O. In Denmark, Absalon. In Norway, ROC. In Switzerland, later P26. Country after country quietly built its own hidden army, all part of the same broad design, all kept secret from the very public they were meant to protect. And that secrecy is the seed of everything that would later go wrong. Because a network like this is, by design, unaccountable. It is hidden from Parliament. It is hidden from the voters. It is known only to a tiny circle inside the intelligence services and the military, and to their sponsors abroad. As long as its only purpose was to wait for a Soviet invasion that never came, that secrecy was merely unsettling. But these networks were not built in politically calm countries. And in one country in particular, the enemy the network was really watching was not the Red Army massing in the east. It was the ordinary voters at home. Italy was different, and the difference is the key to the whole dark turn in the story. Every Western European country feared a Soviet invasion. But Italy had a second fear, one that was closer, more immediate, and entirely homegrown. Italy had the largest communist party in all of Western Europe, a huge, well-organized, genuinely popular movement that regularly won a vast share of the vote. In Italy, communism was not a distant army on the horizon. It was a political force that might, through entirely legal and democratic means, actually win power. Italians might simply elect the communists. To the Italian establishment and to Italy's allies in Washington and NATO, that possibility was almost as alarming as a Soviet tank invasion. A NATO country, home to American bases, falling into communist hands at the ballot box was a nightmare scenario for the Western Alliance. And it quietly reshaped what the Italian stay-behind network was really for. Gladio in Italy was set up in the 1950s by the Italian Military Intelligence Service, working with the CIA. On paper, its mission was the standard one: prepare to resist a Soviet occupation. Recruits were trained in sabotage and guerrilla tactics at a secret base on the rugged coast of Sardinia, learning to handle explosives, radios, and weapons. And across the Italian countryside, the network buried scores of hidden arms, caches the Italians called each one a nasco stuffed with guns, ammunition, and explosives, tucked into remote hiding places to be dug up when the day came. When Gladio was finally exposed decades later, investigators would go hunting for those caches and find that some had quietly gone missing, their contents unaccounted for. All of that fits the official stay-behind template, at least in outline. But Italy also offered an early, documented glimpse of how such an apparatus could bend toward domestic politics. In 1964, amid a period of political crisis, a senior officer named General Giovanni de Lorenzo drew up a contingency plan, later known as the Piano Solo, for the paramilitary police to seize control in an emergency, occupying key sites and detaining political figures, many of them on the left. The plan was never carried out, and its exact intent is still argued over. But it was real, and it showed something important. The Italian security state already had blueprints for turning its emergency machinery inward, against its own citizens, in the name of stopping the left. That is the shadow Gladio was living inside. The men recruited into it tell you something about its real political character. Alongside patriotic anti-communists of many kinds, the network drew in hardline right-wingers and, controversially, some veterans of Italy's fascist past, men whose hatred of communism was absolute. This was an organization built, at its core, to make sure Italy never went communist, whether the threat came from a foreign army or from Italian voters. Its anti-communism pointed outward at the Soviet Union and inward at a large part of the Italian electorate at the same time. Now hold that fact next to what was happening in Italy in those years, and you can see why suspicion took root. Because Italy in the late 1960s and 1970s did not stay peaceful. It descended into a long, bloody period of political violence and terrorism that Italians remember as the years of Lead, a time of bombings, shootings, and kidnappings that killed and wounded hundreds and left the whole country living in fear. Terrorism in that era came from more than one direction. On the far left, groups like the Red Brigades kidnapped and murdered officials. But some of the deadliest attacks of all, massive, indiscriminate bombings of ordinary people in public places, came from the far right. And it was around those right-wing atrocities that the most serious and disturbing questions about Gladio would eventually gather. Questions about whether a secret anti-communist army, stuffed with extremists and answerable to no one, had stayed in its lane or had stepped off the battlefield of a future war and into the streets of the present one. This is the part of the story where care matters most, because it is where documented fact and unproven theory are most easily and most dangerously blurred together. The dark theory has a name: the strategy of tension. The idea is that certain elements within the Italian state and their allies among neo-fascist militants deliberately carried out or enabled acts of terrorism, and then saw them blamed on the far left. The goal in this telling was to frighten ordinary Italians, to make them recoil from the chaos, to discredit the communists, and to push the frightened public toward a strong, right-leaning, order-restoring state. Terror as a political tool aimed inward. The years of lead gave the theory its grim exhibits. In December 1969, a bomb tore through a bank in Piazza Fontana in Milan, killing more than a dozen people. The authorities first blamed anarchists and the left, though the trail would eventually lead toward the neo-fascist right. In August 1980, a colossal bomb ripped apart the railway station in Bologna on a crowded summer morning, murdering 85 people in the single deadliest attack of the era, an atrocity for which neo-fascist militants were ultimately convicted after years of legal battles. The Piazza Fontana case shows how tangled and bitter this history became. Suspicion eventually settled on militants of a neo-fascist group, and the courts wrestled with the case for decades through trials, appeals, and reversals, stretching across a generation without ever delivering a final, definitive conviction of the actual bombers, even as later rulings affirmed that the atrocity had come from the neo-fascist right. Italians watched their justice system fail, again and again, to nail down who had murdered their fellow citizens, and to explain why the first official finger had pointed so confidently at the left. That failure, the sense of a truth deliberately kept just out of reach, did as much to fuel the darkest theories as any single piece of evidence. So what is actually established and what is not? Here, honesty has to be surgical. What is documented is genuinely damning. Italian courts and parliamentary investigations spent decades untangling these cases, and they found real, disturbing links between neo-fascist terrorists and parts of the Italian security apparatus, evidence of investigations steered off course, of protection extended to killers, of a state that in places colluded with or shielded the very men spreading terror. A convicted far-right terrorist named Vincenzo Vinci Guerra, responsible for a lethal 1972 car bombing, told investigators outright that he had enjoyed the protection of elements within the state and pointed to a broader anti-communist apparatus behind the violence. That parts of the Italian state were entangled with right-wing terror is not a fringe claim. It is supported by court verdicts and official inquiries. There was also a genuinely strange institution sitting in the middle of this Italian story, a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, or P2, led by a shadowy financier named Licio Gelli. When P2 was exposed in the early 1980s, its membership list read like a roster of the Italian power structure. Military officers, intelligence chiefs, business leaders, politicians, journalists, all bound together in a covert society with a distinctly authoritarian, anti-communist agenda. P2 was real, its exposure a national scandal, and it deepened the sense that beneath Italy's public democracy ran a hidden network of powerful men willing to operate outside the law. It was not the same thing as Gladio, but it belonged to the same murky world, and it is part of why Italians found the darkest suspicions so easy to believe. The Italian parliament itself eventually took the question seriously, running a long-running commission into the massacres and the terrorism of those years. Its investigators sifted the evidence for decades, And while they did not hand down a single tidy verdict that pinned every bombing on a secret army, they documented enough steered investigations, protected suspects, official lies, to establish that the Italian state had not been an innocent bystander to the violence of the years of lead. That much is on the record, so the truthful picture is jagged and uncomfortable. Yes, a secret anti-communist army existed, packed with extremists, unaccountable to the public. Yes, parts of the Italian state colluded with right-wing terrorists during the years of lead, and courts have said so. But no, it has not been established that Gladio itself was the hidden hand behind the great massacres, nor that a single NATO terror plot orchestrated the bloodshed of a continent. Between the proven collusion and the total conspiracy lies a gap that the evidence, so far, does not close, and honesty means naming that gap instead of papering over it. But here is the line the maximal version leaps straight over. It is one thing to say that elements of the Italian state colluded with neo-fascist terrorists. It is a much larger thing to say that Gladio, the specific stay-behind network, planned and executed these massacres as an organization, or that NATO ran a coordinated campaign of false flag terror across the whole of Europe. That sweeping claim is not proven. Investigators themselves have cautioned that it cannot be said with certainty that an attack like the Bologna bombing was a Gladio operation. The overlap between the stay-behind world and the terrorist world is real in places. Some individuals moved in both. But overlap is not the same as a directed program, and the grandest versions of the theory rest heavily on the work of a small number of authors, whose sweeping conclusions many professional historians regard as going well beyond the evidence. The whole thing broke into the open almost by accident, because of a magistrate doing his job. In the 1980s, an Italian investigating judge named Felice Casson was digging back into that lethal 1972 car bombing, and his search led him into the archives of Italy's military secret service. There, among the files, he found the paper trail of a secret organization, a stay-behind network that no one had ever told the public about. He pressed for answers, and the pressure climbed all the way to the top of the Italian government. And so, on the 24th of October, 1990, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti did something extraordinary. He confirmed, before the Italian Parliament, that Operation Gladio was real. A secret, NATO-linked, stay-behind army had existed in Italy for decades. He acknowledged its purpose, handed over documentation, and reportedly provided a list of hundreds of civilians who had been part of the network. He made clear this had been known at the highest levels, that Italy's leaders across the years had been aware such a structure existed. The confession detonated across Europe, because if Italy had one, what about everyone else? One after another, other Western European governments were forced to confront their own stay-behind networks, and the existence of the wider system came into public view. And the reckoning looked different in each country, which is itself a lesson in how careful the truth-telling has to be. Switzerland investigated its own secret network, P26, with an official inquiry that produced a detailed public report, and largely concluded that its stay-behind army, however troubling its secrecy, had not been running a domestic terror campaign. Belgium, which had suffered its own wave of unsolved and horrifying attacks in the 1980s, opened a parliamentary inquiry that probed possible links between that violence and shadowy far-right and security service circles, and came away with grave suspicions, but no clean, conclusive answer. Country after country found the same basic shape: a real secret network, genuine unease about what it might have touched, and, in most cases, no proof of the darkest charges. On the 22nd of November, 1990, the European Parliament passed a resolution condemning the whole secret apparatus, demanding full investigations and calling for these hidden paramilitary structures to be dismantled once and for all. That is the solid bedrock of the story, and it is remarkable enough on its own. A continent discovering, essentially overnight, that secret armed networks had been operating beneath its democracies for 40 years, unknown to its voters and largely beyond the reach of its parliaments. So what do the honest conclusions look like? The stay-behind networks were real, official, and widespread. That is settled. Their original purpose, to resist a feared Soviet occupation, is documented and, in its own Cold War logic, understandable. Their profound problem was their unaccountability. Secret armies loyal to an ideology, hidden from the public, are a stand-in danger in any democracy, whatever their intentions. And in Italy specifically, the historical record does show real collusion between elements of the state and right-wing terrorists during the years of lead. What remains unproven and genuinely contested is the grandest charge that Gladio itself, or NATO as a whole, ran a deliberate campaign of terror against European civilians. That is what both popular versions get wrong. The dismissers are wrong because Gladio was absolutely real, confirmed by the very governments that ran it. The maximalists are wrong because they take the darkest possible interpretation, true in fragments, and inflate it into a total, proven conspiracy that the evidence does not support. The real lesson of Gladio is quieter and, in its way, more disturbing than either fantasy. It is what happens when a democracy builds a secret army in the dark and tells no one how. Once such a thing exists, no one can ever again fully account for what it did or didn't do. And the truth splits permanently into the part that is documented and the part that is lost in shadow. Gladio really existed. Parts of what it touched were genuinely sinister, and the rest may never be known for certain, which is exactly the price a society pays for keeping an army secret from itself.